I feel that as it slowly melts. It seems like it's clear. It comes the sun. It comes the sun. It's alright. It comes the sun. It comes the sun. It's alright. It's alright.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar tonight, The Threat to Community-Owned Solar. So happy to have tons of folks pouring in here. My name is Julia Nurbin, and I am the Executive Director of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, and one of the conveners of this webinar tonight. We have a number of members of our coalition on tonight, and I wanted to give a hey to Kyle from Minneapolis Climate Action, and Lee from Community Power, Jenna from Vote Solar, and John and from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Timothy from Cooperative Energy Futures, and Puya as well from Cooperative Energy Futures. One of the things we're going to do tonight is we'll be actively answering your questions in the chat. Puya has committed to trying to respond in a timely way. So if you're curious about something, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll do as best as we can to get an answer to you. We will also have a section for question and answers at the end, and you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions then as well. All right. Well, let's begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. So Kyle, if you could give us the next slide, please. So wherever you may be, let us acknowledge that we're all on Indigenous land. Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this territory. We acknowledge that the trauma that is embedded in the foundation, is embedded in the foundation of this country, and the land we reside on came under control of the United States through genocide, slavery, and ongoing occupation. We recognize the historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted all of us, especially Indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. By offering this acknowledgement of trauma, we affirm the right of people to bring their whole selves and their stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to create and promote healing, respect, and love. Taking a deep breath before we dive in tonight. All right, Kyle, can you share the next slide? We've got a busy evening for you. We're going to give you a little bit of an introduction to the Just Solar Coalition, and you'll hear from Kyle and myself on that. Next, we'll turn to Timothy Denherter-Thomas and John Farrell, who will give the bulk of the comments on the topic tonight. And then we'll be turning the mic over to Jenna from Vote Solar, and she'll talk a little bit about the kinds of actions that we're hoping people might take. And at the end, we'll have some time for review of maybe some talking points that you can use as sharing some of this information with others, as well as a question and answer period as time allows. Next slide. So you may have heard about the Just Solar Coalition. We are a group that formed back in 2015, just after the original community solar legislation had passed in Minnesota. We were incredibly excited about the fact that we were going to have the opportunity to build distributed, community-owned projects, and we're getting to work figuring out how to make this happen. But there were a lot of barriers along the way. And there were a number of organizations who were asking the question, if we were really serious about this new energy revolution being something that was accessible to all Minnesotans, how are we going to position ourselves to make sure that in this bonanza of the energy revolution that some folks didn't get left behind? So we started pulling together a conversation between solar developers and nonprofits who care about equity, nonprofits who really focused on climate change, and said, how can we together be more articulate and more purposeful at making sure that as we roll out all of these solar programs, that we can make sure that that everybody has a chance to participate. So next slide, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Kyle, who will tell you a little bit about the work that we are doing today and the successes we've had in the past 8 years.
Thank you, Julia. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here for this important topic. I am the Executive Director of Programs and Engagement at Minneapolis Climate Action, but I also coordinate the Just Solar Coalition. We are, as Julia said, a coalition of organizations that are nonprofits, companies, solar development companies, and community organizations and community members. And our four main areas of action and connection are to educate and inspire, shape public policy, build solar projects, and to move the market. And a little bit briefly about those areas. We really work to educate the public about disparities in the solar industry and energy system, and build a moral commitment to equity. In the public policy space, we do things like we're doing this evening. We promote public policy that increases equity across the solar industry and our energy system. And with building solar projects, all of us are involved in the solar realm in one way or another in the Just Solar Coalition, and some of us actually build solar projects. You can see more about them on our website, but they include community solar gardens like the Shiloh Temple project done in North Minneapolis by Cooperative Energy Futures, North High Community Solar Garden in North Minneapolis, and we also employ local staff to lead this work. And moving the market, we move the market by challenging solar developers, for-profit and nonprofit, to promote our values of justice and inclusion, and really using solar and community solar as a tool for energy democracy and deeper systems change. And
so next,
we will welcome two incredible experts that we are so lucky to have in our community. Timothy Denherter-Thomas from Cooperative Energy Futures, and John Farrell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I know, as someone deeply involved in this work, I am so thankful that we have their expertise and their passion and their generosity. So take it away. I believe it's just on to our presentation.
Thanks so much, Kyle, for that kind introduction, and to all of you who are showing up in an evening to talk about solar. outside of regular business hours and in response to some fairly big challenges. I wanted to start with this slide because a lot of what is useful for understanding what is happening in terms of the threats to local solar goes back over 100 years to when this fellow was working with Thomas Edison on setting up large utility companies. Samuel Insull was Thomas Edison's right-hand man, and he is the one who helped to arrange the situation that we have today, where we have monopoly private companies that provide electricity service with oversight from public regulators through a Public Utilities Commission or a Public Service Commission. So we owe to this man the fact that we have Xcel Energy or Otter Tail Power or Minnesota Power as monopoly private corporations that provide us electricity service. And the trade-off that comes with that, of course, being that that regulation is often insufficient to guaranteeing the public interest. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get through this in terms of how that plays out, but I think it's always really important to start back at the beginning. And the beginning was in the early 1900s as these small businesses began to consolidate into larger utilities, and to do so with the public blessing of monopoly service. So we can move to the next slide then. I'll bring us forward a little bit. And I'll bring us forward 100 years, actually. And this is to 2013, about 10 years ago. And the Edison Electric Institute is a trade organization of investor-owned utility companies. So all of the ones that I named that are in Minnesota, plus about 150 to 200 more across the country, are members of this organization, which performs research, coordinates their lobbying agenda, et cetera. And 10 years ago, they commissioned this study called Disruptive Challenges. If you look for it online, you can still find it. I pulled out a particular quote from it just to highlight that one of the key findings of this report for the members of the Edison Electric Institute for these utilities was that disruptive challenges, which included things like rooftop and community solar, were a threat to their business model, a threat to their revenues, could mean increasing costs, lower profitability, particularly over the long term. So this report was commissioned because solar was really starting to take off in two particular places, in Hawaii and in California. And the utilities there were trying to figure out, how do we respond to this? And the outcome of this report was helping to coordinate investor-owned utilities across the country in their response to rooftop and to community solar, which I often just summarize as local solar. So we can go to the next slide, bring this up to today. What happens these days is that utilities often obscure the truth about rooftop and community solar because of that report 10 years ago, because they know that it presents a threat to them. So utilities will use lots of phrases, lots of words, lots of arguments to say why rooftop and community solar are problematic. But this conversation, which took place in a courtroom in Arizona last fall, uncovers the real truth of it. So this is an attorney for solar companies who has on the stand a witness for Arizona Public Service, an investor-owned utility. And he walks through in his questioning, essentially, this line of questioning is essentially lots of customers are doing things like local solar and rooftop solar, and that's a business risk for your utility. Yep. And you'd agree that these investments by customers in rooftop and community solar can replace what the utility might otherwise spend on. Yep. And that's why utilities oppose them? Yes. And what's remarkable about that is that utilities don't often admit to this being the truth. They will say it's about reliability, or they'll say it's about saving customers money, or they'll even say it's about equity. But what they're really hiding in all of that, these investor-owned utility companies, is this truth that they can make money by building power plants or building power lines or doing things like that. And if we instead collectively invest in energy solutions for ourselves, we will take away from the profits that utility company can make. I'm going to hand it over to Timothy now, who's going to walk through kind of what's at stake here with this issue with investor-owned utility companies and their motivations.
Thank you, John. And again, thanks for everyone coming out. Timothy Donner Thomas with Cooperative Energy Futures. When we were involved in these fights 10 years ago, a lot of the conversation was really around, are we going to transition to clean energy sources? And I think before we go a lot further, I just want to highlight that we're in a very different conversation today. And the conversation we're in today is, how are we going to transition to clean energy sources? And I think it's really important to look at the situation that we're in as kind of a fork in the road. And let's recognize that these are not two incompatible models, but there are some very important tensions. And in the context of monopoly power that John just highlighted, what we think of as valuable, fast, efficient, all of these things can be different. So are we going to, in our energy transition, focus on a few large projects that are usually far away from where we use energy and that are generally owned and controlled either by electric utilities or large private investors, as there's a growing number of large private companies doing these sorts of projects and selling their power to utilities? Or is our vision of an energy future more focused on many smaller projects, mostly close to where we use energy, and as much as possible created and owned by local communities, whether that's rooftop solar or community scale projects serving communities? And Kyle, if you can hit the next, just wanted to highlight again, this is not an either or. We're going to do some of both, but there's some really important choices that we have to make. And I want to highlight a few questions that keep coming up in these discussions that I think are really important for us to dig into. First, which of these paths is faster? Which is actually going to get more clean energy online rapidly? Which of these paths is more affordable? And I think looking at that in terms of cost, both to ratepayers, people who use energy, and also to society as a whole, and other hidden costs we don't always look at. And which path is fairer and distributes benefits more equitably? How do we ensure that the benefits of this transition are shared and that the costs are not unevenly borne by the people who are most vulnerable? And I wanted to highlight these questions because in the conversation that's happening right now, one of the most immediate threats that caused us to put this together is that Xcel put forward a proposal to dramatically undercut the compensation that they are paying to subscribers, which we now know are either mostly residents or local governments and other public institutions. Only about 30% are private companies. They're proposing to dramatically undercut that compensation for projects that have already been built, based on the argument that there is cheaper, more affordable, faster ways to do that, and that the approach that has been taken so far is really not equitable. And so all of these claims are coming up in the advocacy that we're seeing from investor-owned utilities. One of the things that I'll always remember is a while ago, Xcel had a campaign that came out, utility-owned solar, big, large-scale, moving power long distances is solar done right. And what we want to talk about today is really what's going on under the hood here, recognizing, as John highlighted, that utilities time and time again have opposed alternatives that actually compete with how they generate energy. And so before we dig into some of those detailed questions, I just want to make sure we're starting from the same place in terms of where we're at. Because as John has said, the types of fights that we're having here in Minnesota have happened all over the country. There have been attacks on net metering and rooftop solar by utilities. And that's actually, one of the concerning things that some of our elected officials have stated around this too, is that it's time not only to revisit compensation for community solar, but also rooftop solar and other key pieces of local solar and distributed energy movement. Before we dig in, if you can go to the next slide, I want to start with something we're probably all clear about, which is that clean energy costs have dropped dramatically in the past 10 to 15 years. This is the overall levelized cost of electricity from a variety of sources. And solar is that yellow line that starts out, by far the most expensive back in 2009 and is now one of the cheapest energy sources available. Wind is the only one that's actually below it. And you have gas and geothermal slightly above that, and coal and nuclear and gas peaker plants massively more expensive. So you would look at this chart and say, oh, this just makes economic sense that we'd switch to clean energy. And in fact, yes, if you go to the next slide, over the course of the last decade, the vast majority of new energy generating capacity that has been built in this country is clean energy. It's a lot of wind, and especially in the last few years, it's a lot of solar. Essentially, since about 2015, on average, there have been a few exceptions. The vast majority of the new power plant capacity that's been built in this country has been clean. And you're actually starting to see in many areas net reductions in the amount of dirty energy that's online. Now, you would look at these two things and say, clean energy is cheaper. And we're building a lot of it. It's really changing the energy grid. That must mean that energy is getting more affordable. Now, many of you know what's been happening with our energy rates, so the slide will come as no surprise. But if you look at those two things, that's a valid conclusion. If clean energy sources are some of the cheapest energy sources available, and we're building a lot of them, our cost should at least be stabilizing, if not maybe actually starting to decline. Well, no. If you go to the next slide, here's what our energy prices from utility electricity, one back, are doing in Minnesota. They're rising steadily. They're in recent years actually rising fairly sharply. Now, we're going ahead here. Go back, please. Sorry. Thank you. I want to highlight there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is energy utilities are compensated not simply based on the cost to generate energy. Energy utilities are compensated based on all of the investments they have made in physical infrastructure, whether that's power plants, whether that's power lines, pipelines from the gas side. There's all of this stuff that the utilities built. And in fact, utilities are allowed to get a rate of return on those power plants and infrastructure they've built, even if they're no longer useful. So one factor that's going on here is, as you've had a growing volume of old power plants that are reaching the end of their life or are actually having to be retired or no longer being operated because there's cheaper and cleaner resources out there, ratepayers are still paying for that power. We also still have a lot of power plants on the grid that are dependent particularly on gas. And several times in the last few years, we've had massive spikes in the cost of gas that have really cost energy users a lot of money, including here in Minnesota. Utilities have been going on about how local solar, particularly community solar, has been raising costs. But there's a lot of complexity, which we can talk about at the end of the call for those who want to get into it, as to what they're counting is really not apples to apples. When they're looking at local solar, really all the costs to distribute that and get that to customers are included in what they consider the price. Whereas for more of these centralized projects, those costs to transmit are not part of the calculation. And John will talk a little bit more about that later. But in this calculation of what is energy costs, I wanted to highlight that in terms of what it actually costs to generate energy, it's not a uniform value. First and foremost, if you go to the next slide, it depends on where that energy is generated, right? We have a grid that has large scale generation, a transmission system that moves lots of power long distances, and then local distribution. If you click next, at the distribution scale, when energy is delivered to a residential customer, the value of that energy being distributed to that residential customer is about 14 cents. On the commercial end, it depends on the commercial customer, but it's more on the 8 to 14 cent range. That's because when you deliver energy to that site, you're paying for everything upstream. Well, if instead you're delivering energy more at the distribution level, if you click the next, we see a more moderate value of that energy. So at the distribution level, energy that's delivered to substations, you know, it avoids a lot of that need to transmit it long distance. It's saving a lot on those costs. The value of that energy is somewhere in that mid-range, more like 8 to 11 cents. If you're delivering energy to the transmission grid, you have to have all of those super expensive long distance power lines and a lot of energy that's generated on like the wholesale market that's distributed long distance is somewhere in that 3 to 8 cent range. Now, this is a vast simplification, but I really wanted to highlight that depending on where you're generating energy has a big impact on how valuable it is and how much it costs to get it to the end user. There's a second really important factor here in terms of what energy costs, and this is time. So if you go to the next slide, we can go again. One more.
One more.
Yep. Okay, so people use energy at different times of day and different times of year. This is an approximate chart. This is actually from a utility region more in the eastern US, but it's roughly similar. Our peaks are generally in the afternoon in the summer. We also have a peak more in the winter, but it's not as high as the summer peak. And spring and fall tend to be more moderate times of energy use. And the middle of the night is really the lowest energy use time for most of our grid. It's expensive to generate power during those high usage times of day because basically the most expensive power plants are operating then. So there's a very high value to energy that's delivered at those times of day. Well, what does solar do? If you can click again. Most solar production is, sorry, one back. Most solar production is in the summer, roughly in the middle of the day, which is not a perfect overlap with that peak, but it has substantial overlap. And there's quite a bit of production in the spring and fall too. So when we're looking at solar energy that's generated close to where it's used, it's both overlapping with very high value times to produce energy. And it's also generating energy at a place that is able to offset a lot of the upstream costs to get that energy to where it's needed. The big takeaway from all of this is simply what it costs to generate energy varies a lot by place and by time. And so if you're having a conversation and the utility is making a comparison simply to the retail rate, or simply to a different type of energy that's generated at a different location on the grid or at a different point in time, we're not necessarily doing an apples to apples comparison, and we're not looking at the real savings or the real cost to generate that energy. And there's a lot of complex math that goes into really what is the apples to apples comparison. But I wanted to highlight that you can't trust those very simplistic comparisons without doing a lot of digging. And as John said, you can't trust utilities to give you information that is straightforward or really providing an apples to apples because they have an incentive not to do so. I wanted to highlight a few things that are really about the speed of the transition before I pass it back to John. You can go to the next slide. This is a map of Xcel Energy's hosting capacity. Now, essentially what this means is if you look at the existing grid, where does the grid have space to accommodate more renewable energy. And just this visual is a simplification. There's a lot of electrical engineering under the hood, but in general, places where you see a lot of green have a lot of space on the grid, and places that are red don't. Now, this is just for Excel, so there's lots of parts of Minnesota that are not covered by this map, but everything that's on this map is Excel's grid serving customers in the state. And you can get a rough sense of where the grid has space. Now, this is not 100% rule of thumb, but the takeaway to take from this slide is there's a lot of grid space to add more renewable energy where there's a lot of energy being used, which is in urban areas. You can see the Twin Cities, you can see some green spots in Mankato and Faribault and St. Cloud and a few other areas where there's high density of energy usage. And in most, not universally, but in most of rural Minnesota, a lot of the grid is fairly congested. There's already a lot of renewable energy and other power plants in some cases on the grid. And there's not a lot of capacity to add more without building a lot of additional power lines to move that power to where it's needed. And that's expensive. And that often isn't counted when the utility says this is what it costs to produce utility scale or large scale electricity. That transmission cost to move the power isn't counted. Additionally, building that new infrastructure takes a really long time. This is in the news all the time. The backlog to build new transmission projects and other capacity to move energy long distances is a huge problem for getting energy on the grid when you're trying to do that energy big, centralized, far away from where it's used. And we're going to have to do some of that. But I really want to highlight, if we think that it's going to be fast to build most of our energy sources far away from population centers, we're somehow assuming that building these giant transmission projects, which often take a decade or longer to finance and construct, is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. We're missing a big piece of the puzzle. And this actually plays out in terms of how renewable energy has been developed in Minnesota. If you go to the next slide. This is a chart that is basically showing you annual solar installations in Minnesota of different types. The dark blue at the very bottom is all of the residential solar being built in the state. You can see it's ramping up dramatically, and we need to see a lot more of that. The yellow is commercial. So again, this is residential and commercial that is directly powering energy users. There's this huge green chunk that is community solar, and these are larger scale, usually under 1 megawatt systems that are generating energy onto the grid, but they're at a modest scale. They're not accessing the transmission grid. They're mostly accessing the local distribution grid that already has capacity to move power. And you can see a few big pulses, mostly in 2016, 2017, and expected in this case from 2023, and coming up in some new projects that utilities are developing for utility scale solar. But it actually hasn't been as much as the local solar that's been built in the state, whether it's rooftop, customer sited, or community. And what you tend to see is utilities doing a couple of big projects here and there when they have a lot of grid capacity, new wires to connect that energy in. And I wanted to again highlight our future is a mix of all of the above. But when you hear an argument that the only way to do solar fast is to do it big and utility owned, the data really doesn't bear that out. That's not what's been happening. And I don't see any reason why that's likely to change soon, given that those really big transmission projects, which are super expensive and cost a lot of money for ratepayers, take a really long time. We're going to have to do some of that. It's going to be an important part of the solution, but we need to make sure that the utility isn't able to undercut or cut off the opportunity for local solar that can get here faster and in many ways with greater benefits. I'm going to turn it back over to John to talk a little bit more about some of those costs and benefits of different types of solar.
Thanks, Timothy. On this chart, I'm going to encourage everyone to ignore the leftmost bar and look at the three on the right: utility scale, high cost model, community, and rooftop solar. And the top end of the colors is what matters here. And what we found in our analysis of utility scale and community and rooftop solar is that they all cost about the same to Minnesota electric ratepayers. Utility scale solar, when you factor in the delivery costs, the transmission costs that Timothy talked about, which is represented in blue on this chart, costs about the same amount to Minnesota electric customers as community solar, as does rooftop solar. And that's partly because community and rooftop solar, by being close to where we use energy, actually avoids those transmission and distribution costs. And that energy that's produced locally can help avoid additional costs to expand that infrastructure as we use more electricity. So there's a link here. I think the link has also been put in the chat by Kyle, but I just want to emphasize, if you want to dig in, we've got a brief presentation and then what I call like an expert level presentation that kind of dives into how we got these numbers. But I use the same kind of analysis that the utility has to use when it makes the case to the Public Utilities Commission to recover the costs from ratepayers to do utility scale solar and wants to earn a profit on it in order to figure out what the cost of utility scale solar was to Minnesota customers. And it's a lot more than the utility says when they're being quoted in the newspaper. We can go to the next slide. So local solar is cost effective is the key takeaway there. And it competes very favorably with solar at any size. Local solar is also really fast. This is an excerpt from an article that was in Canary Media about the cutting of rooftop solar compensation in California, which you might have heard about. You can see in the chart the nosedive in terms of the amount of rooftop solar that was being developed by companies there in California, because they slashed rooftop solar compensation by almost 3/4. What was interesting was this sentence in the article where they had compared the amount of local solar that was being developed in California over the last couple of years to all of the solar that was being developed in California. And funny enough, just like in Minnesota, the local solar was carrying the freight for California's clean energy development. More of the clean energy, more of the solar being developed was actually on rooftops and in neighborhoods than it was in those huge, giant utility scale solar arrays. So if we're in a hurry to solve the climate crisis, we really do need local solar to work because it's actually something that can deploy quickly and doesn't rely on those giant infrastructure investments that can take 5 or 10 years or even more. So we can go to the next slide then. So we know local solar is cost effective, that it's competitive. I'll go back. Thanks, Rick. That's great. We know local solar is cost effective. We know that it can deploy really fast. We know it has several other benefits about resiliency, around giving opportunities to own a slice of the clean energy economy. It's actually the least cost path to a carbon-free future, because with all of this distributed energy and supplying energy locally, it actually frees up capacity on the transmission system, on the high voltage power lines for some of the big stuff to be built without building those new transmission lines. And we get up to 30 times more jobs for every $1 million we spend on solar when we build it locally, instead of when we build it at huge scale. Next slide, please. ILSR actually published a report, and I think my colleague Katie Kienbaum is actually in the participant room here. She authored this report called Advantage Local that we published last year. It's available freely on our website, and the next two charts here are taken from that. There's a lot of numbers and a lot of things on here. What I want to emphasize is this: if the bars are in color, then they represent local folks, maybe co-op members or solar subscribers, local lenders, local landowners, or local governments. And the bigger the bar to the right, the more benefit for those folks that are local. And so what we found was that locally owned community solar, and especially cooperatively owned community solar, which is what we modeled, brings in far more benefits to the community, almost as much as 3 times more benefits to the community financially than projects that are not owned locally, that are owned by some outside entity or third party. And on the next slide, we did the similar comparison with both community solar and with rooftop solar, and looked at third party owned. So if you were, for example, leasing your solar panels versus if you were able to finance and own them yourself. that again, as much as 3 times the financial benefit, and maybe even a little bit more if you're able to have local ownership. So I want to emphasize this for one particularly important reason, which is there's no local ownership for utility scale solar or for utility scale wind or for transmission lines. So the opportunity to have these benefits rests on us being able to develop solar in a community scaled way, whether that's in community solar or on rooftops or in our neighborhoods. We have to have that if we want access to these big local benefits. And we're not going to get that at the utility scale. And as Timothy said, we're going to expect to do solar at all different scales, but the utility is out to get it in only one fashion. And what we're trying to say is we need it all. And we need it because it's cost effective. We need it because it's fast. We need it because it has all sorts of benefits, including more dollars into our communities. So I'll just sum up the presentation that Timothy and I have given with 2 points that are on this next slide. Just to be really clear, we need fast, affordable local solar to meet our climate goals, and utilities lie about solar to protect their shareholders. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much, Timothy and John. That is an amazing overview of all of the benefits of our locally produced clean energy. I'm going to talk a little bit about some ways you can take action. I realize that we didn't fully go over one of the current issues, which is a docket at the Public Utilities Commission, where the commission is deciding on whether to accept a proposal from Xcel to pay subscribers of Solar Gardens pre-2017 a much lower rate than they are currently getting. These are projects that signed 20-year contracts, and so they're trying to change the compensation in the midst of a contract even. So there have already been hundreds, I think over 600 comments in the docket against Xcel's proposal to cut the compensation for these solar gardens. And a couple more things you can do is attend the February 15th Public Utilities Commission hearing, where they are taking up and deciding on this issue. We'll put a link to the chat where you can sign up. You can share a Facebook event that we'll also put in the chat, so you can get your friends to come, get your neighbors to come. It is during the day on a Thursday, which we know is hard. 10 a.m. on a Thursday, you know, a lot of folks have other obligations going on, but as many of you that can come or can round up some folks to come and support the solar industry, that would be great. There'll be a little bit of food, there'll be friendship, there'll be buttons that you can wear showing your support. We ask that when you do sign up, you read through. There's some protocol that is expected at the commission when you do attend an event. So just review that carefully before you come. And there will be folks there to meet you and kind of walk you through the day and what's going to happen. So a really important and pressing moment right now for the solar industry in Minnesota. Another way that you can take action is on the legislative side of things, because we are seeing some pressure on the legislative end of things to roll back some of the progress that we've made. And so we have to really fight to protect what we have right now, the rights we have to local clean energy. One thing you can do is you can come to the Capitol on March 12th to meet and lobby your legislator. The Rise and Repair Coalition is having a lobby day that day, and they will match you up with legislators and give you kind of a walkthrough on how you talk to a legislator about your policy priorities and your interests and what you support. So we'll put those links in the chat, and they'll also be available for you after this. Another thing you can do on the Rise and Repair website, which we will also link, is there's a calendar of really great events, not just solely related to solar, but many other issue areas that this coalition supports. And you can check that events calendar and you can sign up for other things you may be interested in. Kyle, can you go to the next slide, please? Another way that's really great and that often catches the attention of decision makers is writing a letter to the editor. It can be for your local paper usually, and you can talk about why you feel that you want community-owned solar or local clean energy. We're gonna help you if you would need a little help, and you can fill out this Google form to just request a little help on how you go about writing it, what format, how do you submit it, all those things. It is really important for decision makers to hear from their constituents and the people that live in their communities. Obviously, we support it and we're there and we're knocking on doors and we're in their offices, but it is really, really great when their community members come in or write a public letter in support of local clean energy. It really gets their attention. So if you have any inkling that you would like to be public and write a little letter, please definitely fill out that form, or go ahead on your own. If you have the skills to do it, go ahead and write a letter to your local paper. Another thing you can do is get involved in developing a solar project in your community. Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light supports congregations and businesses and residential homeowners on getting solar on their homes. They do that through supporting people like Solar United Neighbors and their co-op buying programs, where people group together and they show interest in having solar, so they get often lower prices. There are really good contractors they work with that can help you out. And the same thing happens through Minnesota Renewable Now, Minneapolis Climate Action, and Cooperative Energy Futures. These are all great resources for you if you want to start a project on your own home or in your community, or if you know people who are talking about it and want more information, direct them to any of these resources and they can get some really great information to be able to do that. And I think I hit everything. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. So we can move on to the next piece.
Thanks so much, Jenna. I just thought it's great to remind you that there's articles being written about this all the time, and it's a great opportunity for us to bring this up at kitchen table conversations or write a letter yourself. So again, just highlighting this is one of the recent pieces of press that lots of people came to me to ask me, what did I think? What should they think? And hopefully you have a sense of what some of the key messages are today and how you can take action. So I'm going to turn this over back to Timothy and to Puya, who are going to talk a little bit about talking points as you respond to your friends and neighbors' questions about this, and to answer any big picture questions that you still have that you haven't been able to get an answer for in the chat. Thank you so much, Puya, for doing an incredible job of responding to people's questions as we have been doing so throughout the night. So next slide, Kyle, and then I think we'll hand it to, I think we may be able to turn the slides off, and we will hand it to Puya.
Yeah, Timothy, I think you were going to take this last section, and basically the points involved here are perhaps two major things that you're going to hear the most people push back on, and that's the so-called net costs of community solar gardens, and like Timothy was talking about this, the speed of transitioning, and the myth that distributed generation or the smaller scale stuff is slower to develop. Timothy, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, I'll dig in on that, and then would love to get questions from whoever has questions. So, one of the things that I think has really laid the foundation for Xcel coming forward with this proposal to cut compensation for existing projects is the fact that for many years they have been reporting both to the Public Utilities Commission and to legislators at the state level that the net cost of community solar is essentially how much the bill credits that are being paid to everyone who subscribes to community solar are higher than what's called the locational marginal price, which essentially means the price on a wholesale market for power that's generated, which is roughly equivalent to the fuel cost of power plants that are operating on that market. Now, I just threw a lot of technical terms at you, but essentially what that means is they're saying that if it wasn't for community solar, people would just be paying for the cost of burning fuel at a natural gas plant or a coal plant. But just the cost of that fuel, or what the additional cost to generate that 1 unit of energy would be. Now, as I mentioned before, that doesn't take into account a number of factors. It doesn't take into account the fact that those large power plants have a transmission cost that is embedded because it has to get the energy from where it's generated to where it is used. Whereas community solar projects have generally been sized and sited in places where the grid already has space and load to accept them. And it also omits the fact that term, the locational marginal price, ignores the cost of building all of those power plants in the first place, which we all pay through our base energy rates that are not included in the fuel clause, which is what Xcel is comparing this to. So it really is a situation where the number that Xcel has been comparing the cost of community solar to is like just the fuel, and not the cost of the power plant, and not the cost of getting the power from the power plant to where it's used, or the differential value of this is energy that's being generated potentially in a more concentrated way in those peak times of day where energy is very valuable. So the question really becomes, how would you do a better calculation? And actually, the state of Minnesota developed a method back in 2014 for estimating the value of solar that really does take into account, what is the value of the power plant you don't have to build, of the transmission lines you don't have to build, as well as the fuel you don't have to burn, as well as the, environmental and other benefits. And, that's still an approximation. It doesn't differentiate between the value of solar when it's right near customers versus the value of solar, 100 miles away, to keep it really simple. But it's a good approximation, and that value of solar is between 2 and 3 times higher than that number that Xcel has been comparing when they keep saying that the community solar program is costing everyone in the state, over $100 million. Now, the current proposal is to revert these existing projects back to the value of solar as it was calculated in 2017. And while that's, not as bad as the thing Xcel has been kind of deceptively comparing community solar to, it doesn't take into account a couple of really important things in terms of the growth of solar as an industry. The first is, the 2017 value of solar is to a certain extent kind of cherry-picked. And that calculation has changed a lot over time. In fact, there is a recalculation due for the value of solar based on the updated estimates of the costs of climate change, which was actually approved by the legislature in their recent session. That would make that calculation higher than what these current projects are already getting compensated. So the fact that the proposal is to go back to 2017 is kind of, it's a certain choice about how we're going to look at the value of solar in terms of calculating the benefit to society. And it's, of course, a choice that dramatically undercuts what solar subscribers who 5 years ago chose to be a part of this were told that they were getting. The second, and I'd say really more important issue with this comparison and why it's a problem, is that regardless of whether the compensation rate is the right rate today, it was the rate that was approved for 25 years when these projects were built. And that set expectations for energy users, the subscribers, whether those are individual households or whether those subscribers are local governments or schools. It set expectations for what they would be getting for that energy. And that in turn set expectations for all of the entities that built and developed community solar for what their revenue would be. And those organizations took out loans and financing on those expectations. And those expectations aren't just a guess, they're actually contractually documented in an agreement between the Solar Garden operators and Xcel Energy, where it says that the bill credit type that is assigned to the garden will apply for the 25-year duration of the project. Now, it's a valuable question, you know, what's the right rate to compensate for solar? But if the Public Utilities Commission is going to now go back and say, well, yeah, Xcel signed a contract with community solar garden operators and agreed to provide these rates for 25 years for these projects that have already been built, but we don't think that's the right rate and that's going to change. That's effectively putting just about all of those existing community solar garden projects financially underwater, retroactively to a contract that's already been signed for 25 years. And there's a lot of valid, you know, concerns and perspectives about how the first round of community solar rolled out. And, you know, as a member-owned cooperative that's been trying to do it very equitably, you know, we don't think it was the best way to do it either. You know, the amount of third-party private ownership and all of that. But it got Minnesota's solar industry off the ground. And it created the baseline and the standard for how we can develop clean energy at scale in the state, and laid the foundations for the really important equity improvements that we put into place in legislation in 2023, which will now make a much more equitable and community-centered program. Additionally, we've got really good data now from the Department of Commerce that even in the old round, which had a lot of these you know, concerns about who's benefiting, 70% of the customers are either residents or public institutions who are benefiting massively. So there's a huge fairness and industry precedent about whether Minnesota is a reliable policy environment to invest and develop renewable energy. That's really important for the future of Minnesota as a clean energy state. You know, if any other business is looking at the community solar program or any other policy that Minnesota sets, if Minnesota already has a track record of going back on contracts that have been agreed to long run, what does that say in terms of Minnesota's regulatory and policy reliability for future projects in the state? And that's a big concern that we think is really important to highlight to the commission as well. I think I've
Timothy,
already
thank you
talked
so
about the
much.
speed issues. Go ahead, Julia.
We are just rounding the corner to 8 o'clock. I think that there may be one last question you can answer, and then I'd like to send us out. If people would, as you are getting ready to log off, we would love to hear if there's additional questions you have. If you put them in the chat, we will be able to respond to those. We'll be sending out a follow-up email from this webinar, and you can get those responses. Timothy, maybe I'll wrap us and then you can answer that question and others that people have if they stay on. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Great. So if you have thoughts on something that you learned or took from this webinar, if you want to throw those in the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, let us know if you still have pending questions. We can try to respond to those in a follow-up fashion. And I just wanted to say, as I leave, you know, I work with tens of thousands of people across the state of Minnesota who are excited about being involved in this climate justice movement. And one of the things we haven't talked about here tonight is the importance of allowing many people to feel powerful in their place. And the impact of being able to be involved in these kinds of projects isn't only measured in dollars and cents and, access to the energy that's created. It's also measured in the committees that people are sitting around, the stories that they're telling their children about the kinds of futures that they're building together. And so I just want people to think about the bigger impact that Xcel is having on the public response to climate change, saying, we don't really need to take care of any of this. We're just going to do it. And when you try, we're going to really make it difficult by creating the kinds of doubt that has been that has sprung up around this Public Utilities Commission challenge. It just makes me really bloomin' angry. And I'm so glad to be here with all of you, thinking about how we together can stand up and say no to the bullies who are trying to make it more difficult for us to be gracefully and powerfully taking action together. So I think that there's probably some additional questions. I think at this point, people can put their follow-up evaluations in the chat and just come off mute if there is another question that you have for Timothy. And otherwise, we will plan to close this down in about 5 minutes. But you can hang on for the ride until we have a few last questions. So thank you and good night. Timothy, I think that you had one more question that you were about to respond to. So why don't you go ahead?
I was mostly just going to say on the speed thing, I think we have covered it in our presentation. I feel like we've really pointed out that, there are very long lag times for large scale projects that require new transmission. And that what we've seen is that on the whole, well, we will obviously do some of both. We've been able to get a lot more localized on energy on the grid fastest.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Please, yes.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, all you.
Hi, I'm Mauli from SolarPod. Recently, I went to Australia in a trade mission with Governor Tim Walz, and I learned a lot about their solar deployment. In Australia, they have almost 32 gigawatts of solar installed for a population of 27 million people, which is quite a bit of solar. And out of the 32 gigawatts, 20 gigawatts is on the rooftop compared to 12 gigawatts on large scale. And then I came to Minnesota. I mean, I'm a solar person in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we have almost 900 megawatts of large scale solar on farmland and 100 megawatts on rooftop. I want to understand what is the goal of this community to say, a community to advocate for rooftop or for community solar gardens, because one knows that you cannot put a nuclear plant on a roof, nor can you put a coal plant on a roof or a hydro plant. You can put only a solar plant. And the reason you put a nuclear, coal, or hydro plant 40 miles away, like Monticello, is because you cannot put it on your roof. And similarly, if you're putting solar near Monticello, like these community solar gardens, you are taking away its real benefits. So I'd like to understand what this particular group of people, what is the goal to advocate more for community solar garden or more for rooftop solar. And I know there are several instances where rooftop has been denied because of grid congestion, but I don't see even one community solar garden denied because of excessive rooftop solar. So I'd like to understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. And I think it's really important to highlight how essential rooftop solar is going to be for the transition, and we need to be doing as much of that as possible. I think we want to highlight here that really the fight right now in the state is are we going to be allowed to do customer owned and community benefiting solar at all at both scales? And yes, we should be doing as much rooftop solar as possible. And one of the risks right now is that, you know, as part of this whole policy push, there are some state legislators saying we should go after and undermine net metering for rooftop solar too. And that's a part of the core part of the problem, what we need to be pushing back on, because that's happened all over the country as well. I want to highlight that community solar, while a lot of it right now has been in rural parts of the state, it has been sized based on the distribution capacity in the area, which means there are local wires serving local load that are servicing those plants. So while it may not be near to where we have the greatest load in the state, it's near to someone who's using the power. And I want to see a lot more community solar in the city and on rooftops benefiting a wide range of users, for example, on commercial warehouses and other buildings, as well as a lot of rooftop solar that's directly serving customers. I think it's really important that we don't pick up what I think is a secondary source of, utility divide and conquer, to suggest that the key question here is rooftop solar versus community solar. We need to do both. We need to do a lot of both. And I wanted to highlight that, yes, community solar gardens do experience capacity constraints frequently. I mean, there are many projects that are shut down because Xcel does not have capacity on the grid for them. And one can look at that and say, well, look, there's competition here between rooftop and community solar. Or one can look at that and say, the real issue here is our utility has not built a grid that makes it possible for all energy users to generate energy in their community. And I think it's really important that as we move towards as much rooftop solar as possible, we are also creating environments, especially that preference and privilege community ownership and projects that are focused on equity and serving customers who really can't be served. Because, even though we can do a massive amount of rooftop solar in the city, we are going to need a diversity of ways that we do this in our general communities. And I think we do need to look at how do we develop renewable energy in a way that's not simply an island for each individual, but is creating capacity at the scale of neighborhoods and communities.
Thanks, Timothy. Very, very insightful. The question I do have is Joshua Pierce. I don't know if I think John Farrell may know him. He was the one who first came up with the levelized cost of energy for solar. And he has written a paper just 2 or 3, 4 months ago. And he has clearly indicated that rooftop solar is by far the most environmentally friendly solar than any kind of farmland solar or ground-mounted solar. And if anybody wants to get a copy of that, they can reach out to me.
Great, thank you.
Got another question there?
All right. Folks, I just want to give people full permission to log off for the night. We have gone well past our reported 8 o'clock. I don't know, Timothy, if you have the ability to stay on for another couple minutes. We don't have to close the room, but I do want to let people go and find their supper.
I can chime in real quickly. I put in the chat, community solar can be rooftop. Shiloh Temple is a community solar garden. So it doesn't have to be either or. It would be better to have a lot more rooftop. There are developers economics that have unfortunately favored ag land.
Totally agree.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Timothy, John, all the
Thank you,
folks who put
everyone.
together the responses.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you, everyone. Shall we sign off, or is there anything we need to check in on?
I think we're probably good. Anything that anyone wanted to touch base on? And
Hang on one sec.
It's still recording.
Oh yeah, let me pause the recording. Thanks for that reminder. Let's see, I got,
And saving the recording.
what do you think?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Are we still recording?
I'm just